I'm back. So last time we discussed absurd walls, which is essentially Camus' metaphor for what the absurd is. It's the wall that we hit when we're looking for meaning in a universe where there's absolutely no possibility that we can know for certain the answers or the meaning to anything, right? It's that wall that we hit. It's that contradiction between our desire for meaning and the lack thereof. So the next section of chapter 1 of the Myth of Sisyphus is section 3, which is philosophical suicide. And this section poses not that religion is philosophical suicide, but rather the leap between the discovery of the absurd and the posing of a universal meaning of reality, that leap of logic between meaninglessness and total universal meaning is the philosophical suicide. That logical gap between meaninglessness and meaning. Because Camus poses that going from a worldview where everything is meaningless to a worldview where everything has meaning. He poses that this reasoning involves a huge gap in logic. Whereas if you're just starting, if you're at the starting point that the universe is meaningful, that there is a God, this makes sense. There's nothing nonsensical about believing in God. But there is something nonsensical about being a nihilist, say, and then somehow from that nihilism, finding God within nihilism. That's what he's referring to, and that's what Kierkegaard does, right? Kierkegaard says that, hey, this universe is meaningless, and somehow along the line, therefore God, right? The universe is meaningless, therefore God. But Camus poses that, hey, that's faulty reasoning, right? Meaninglessness does not conclude God. And of course, I am simplifying Kierkegaard's argument here, but that's a starting point for us as we delve into section 3 of an absurd reasoning, which is philosophical suicide. So let's begin. Philosophical suicide. In this section, and I will share my screen for you YouTubers out there. I actually want to get it into focus mode. Okay, focus mode. Share the screen. Boom. And I don't know. I'm hoping that you can also see my face while I do this. Otherwise, I've noticed that if I'm not also speaking in the video and all you see is the screen, then it's not as good of an experience for the listener. Okay. So let's do this. So in this section, Camus poses his quote, but one truly serious philosophical problem in another way. That is, can you live with the absurd or can you not? When you're confronted with that contradiction between meaninglessness and your desire of meaning, can you live with that feeling? Can you live with that contradiction? So, and of course, that's where that's kind of what he means, right? If you can't live with that contradiction, purely just live with it, then you're going to commit suicide in one of two ways: the physical way or the philosophical way. Philosophical way meaning that you're not living with the absurd because you basically kill off that absurdity through religion, which again, Camus doesn't pose as a bad thing, but that is essentially what you're doing. You're killing off that feeling of absurdity and replacing it with a universal meaning and understanding of reality. So that absurd feeling that Camus is speaking of requires three things. One, a total absence of hope. Two, a continual rejection of hope. And a conscious dissatisfaction with that lack of hope. So remove one of those things and you don't have the absurd. Remove one of those things and you're not living with the absurd. And keep in mind that hope, quote unquote, refers to the hope that there is a possibility that life has meaning and one will find answers. If one of these three conditions were to be removed, as I just said, the absurd would no longer exist. That is, the absurd means nothing if it's agreed to. If it is agreed to, then one commits what Camus calls philosophical suicide. Because what it means to agree to the absurd is to let the absurd lose its absurdity. That is, one is free to simply believe that there is meaning when they realize they can't know anyways, right? All this is absurd, it's all meaningless, there's so many contradictions, so why not just take that leap of faith, as Kierkegaard says, right? So this then reinstills hope and eliminates the feeling of the absurd. So to Camus, religion is the reconciliation of the absurd through scandal. Here, God becomes the absurd, and the believer takes a leap of faith and goes beyond reason. The absurdists, to the contrary, stays within their bounds of knowledge. Likewise, if one is somehow satisfied with their lack of hope, then they may forget about their lack of hope altogether. And this removes them from their feelings of the absurd, it alienates them from the absurd. Now, notice how I'm using the phrase, quote, feeling of the absurd. Camus starts off this section with the feeling of absurd is not, for all that, the notion of the absurd. It lays the foundation for it, and that is all. You aren't, what he means here is that you're not even going to think about the absurd until you've felt the absurd. The feeling of it allows one to consider it. And by considering it, they are forced to confront it. And that's kind of what we talked about in the last section, where great feelings have their own universe, right? And when you're struck with the feeling of the absurd, you enter that universe of the absurd, where the absurd exists. And in that sense, you're forced to contemplate it. You're forced to confront it. So on the following page, Camus gives a great analogy for the absurd. Quote, it's absurd means it's impossible, but also it's contradictory. If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider this act to be absurd. But it is so solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter. Of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. End quote. Now, when all you have is a sword and you're faced with an army of machine gunners, is it worth the fight? Is it worth the fight if you bring a knife to a gunfight? I think this is kind of what Camus is asking here. Is life worth the fight even though it will be a losing battle? For Camus, of course, the answer is yes, right? One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And in the knife to a gunfight example, philosophical suicide would be trying to fight the machine gunners and believing that you'll win. The absurdist, on the other hand, fights the machine gunners fully aware that it will be a losing battle. Right? There is no hope of escaping the fight. There is no hope of winning. You will die. The machine gunners will defeat you. That is, the suicidal sees that there is no hope and is consequently satisfied with taking their own life. The philosophically suicidal sees that there is no hope but embraces the possibility of hope, and so they fight with the satisfaction that they may win. Whereas the absurdist sees that there is no hope, maintains that lack of hope, and even though dissatisfied with that lack of hope, fights the death nonetheless. Because in this, there is no contradiction. The absurdist does not fight with the belief that they'll win, because that would be a contradiction, right? Obviously, you can't win. And the absurdist knows that you can't win. So choosing to fight with the knowledge that you can't win is not a contradiction because you're fighting simply to fight. You're fighting for the thrill of the fight, for the fun of the fight, right? That is, you're accepting death, but likewise rejecting any notion that you need to let it win easily. You accept the fight. You embrace the fight. You live for the sake of living, and that's where the absurdist finds their contradiction. That is, by accepting death, they embrace life. But by embracing life, they likewise are forced to embrace death, right? But not without a fight, not without a rebellion. Sorry for the tangent, but more or less, Camus is trying to say that the absurd doesn't come from the fact that there is no meaning or from our search for meaning, but rather the confrontation between these two things. So the absurd is born from the confrontation between man's instinctual search for meaning and their awareness of its inexistence, or at least their awareness of their inability to verify its existence for certain. The confrontation here is the important part. Without the confrontation, there is no contradiction. There is no quote unquote divorce, as Camus says. It is, quote, a confrontation and an unceasing struggle. And in the discovery of this confrontation, quote, there exists an obvious fact that seems utterly moral, namely, that a man is always prey to his truths. Once he has admitted them, he cannot free himself from them. One has to pay something. A man who has become conscious of the absurd is forever bound to it. This is the point of no return. This is, of course, the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Humanity is kicked out of the garden because they have come to realize a truth. And in the realization of the truth, the whole world then becomes a lie. It's Nietzsche's quote, "The good man sees the whole world as evil," right? And that's from Beyond Good and Evil, if you don't know about that. What he's saying here is that once you encounter the absurd, there is no leaving it. It is an epiphany that can't be forgotten. And Camus says that it is only natural that one should attempt to escape the absurd, and he further claims that all existential philosophers attempt to do so. And for the most part, this is done through God, right? Quoting Jasper, he says that one makes an unthinkable unity of the general and the particular. Camus writes in response, quote, thus the absurd becomes God in the broadest meaning of the word, and that inability to understand becomes the existence that illuminates everything. Nothing logically prepares this reasoning. I can call it a leap, end quote. That's that it's a leap because it's a leap from nihilism to God, a direct leap from nihilism to God. It's not a reasoning where you have nihilism and then you start to contradict the nihilism. It's more so that they believe in nihilism and they also believe in God in a sense, right? So that's the leap in reasoning there. It's not a leap in reasoning because of the end belief in God. It's a leap in reasoning because of the start, because of the contrast between the starting lack of belief to the ending full-on belief, right? Now, this is interesting because if you go back and read the last few pages of Camus' The Stranger, it seems that the, quote, gentle indifference of the world in which Meursault opens himself up to is a godlike ideal. In that sense, while the mystic seeks union with God, the absurdist seeks union with indifference of reality. And I sometimes wonder if these two things are really all that different, right? Moving on, we are confronted with Chestov's approach to the absurd. And in Chestov's approach, the absurd becomes God. And the Chestovian philosophy is essentially summed up in that, quote, we turn toward God only to obtain the impossible. As for the possible, men suffice, end quote. Obtaining the impossible is obviously a contradiction, which I believe is why Camus is claiming that the absurd becomes God, as if by some kind of Zapfian sublimation, right? Quote, Chekhov discovers the fundamental absurdity of all existence. He does not say, quote, this is the absurd, but rather, this is God. We must rely on him even if he does not correspond to any of our rational categories. That is, quote, his greatness is his incoherence. His proof is his inhumanity. One must spring into him and by this leap free oneself from rational illusions. Thus, for Chestov, acceptance of the absurd is contemporaneous with the absurd itself. Being aware of it amounts to accepting it. And the whole logical effort of his thought is to bring it out so that at the same time the tremendous hope it involves may burst forth. That is, quote, his greatness is his incoherence, his proof is his inhumanity. One must spring into him and by this leap free oneself from rational illusions. Thus, for Chestov, acceptance of the absurd is contemporaneous with the absurd itself. Being aware of it amounts to accepting it. And the whole logical effort of his thought is to bring it out so that at the same time the tremendous hope it involves may burst forth, end quote. So remember earlier when Camus stated that at the heart of all beauty, there's something inhuman? Inhumanity is what brings us into contact with the absurd because the absurd is a conflict between our desire, our human desire for meaning, and the inhuman reality of its lack. We are aware that only the human makes beauty beautiful, but we see it as beautiful anyways, right? God, like that which is beautiful, comes into existence as God because of our faith in God. But God is inhuman, right? But he exists because of the human, right? This is the contradiction. This is the incoherence, the very same incoherence of beauty. And in that sense, God likewise estranges us from our very own humanity and forces us to face the absurd, right? And that's why people say in the mystic tradition to surrender, or people on shamanic journeys, you'll say surrender to the shamanic journey, right? Or if you're on a people who do these psychedelic therapy sessions, right? You need to surrender to it. Or in the Christian faith, surrender to God, surrender to Jesus. You're letting that powerful force you're embracing that powerful force and you're surrendering to it, right? So this is kind of what Testov is talking about in a sense, right? And that's where the absurd or God becomes the absurd or the absurd becomes God. Chestov's response is to take that leap of faith, right? And embrace God, surrender to him, and the beauty that comes with it. But to Camus' point, the absurd ceases to be the absurd when it becomes something eternal, right? That is, the absurd is only in man's universe. And, quote, the absurd is no longer that evidence that man ascertains without consenting to it. The intoxication of the irrational and the vocation of rapture turn a lucid mind away from the absurd. To Chestov, reason is useless, but there is something beyond reason. To an absurd mind, reason is useless and there is nothing beyond reason, end quote. Again, Chestov fights uselessly, believing there is something beyond the fight, right? Camus fights uselessly, knowing there is nothing beyond the fight, right? Camus is saying that there isn't anything beyond reason purely because reason is more or less the mind. And it's not that there isn't anything beyond the mind, but more so that one cannot prove the existence of anything beyond the mind, right? Quote, in his failure, says Kierkegaard, the believer finds his triumph, end quote. Because the lack of reason gives room for the believer to take that leap towards God, right? You can't know anything for certain, so why not just believe? This brings to mind what my dad used to tell me when I was young and I was atheist, right? He said, it won't hurt you to just believe in God. And while this is very much true, I simply wasn't able to, right? It was just as Camus said about the absurd. When you realize it, you're forever bound to it, right? It's a divorce, like you said. It's a contradiction. Now, I don't fully agree with this because people can definitely drastically change their minds on things, especially given certain experiences, right? You can be in a life-altering experience and you can drastically take that leap that Kierkegaard's talking about. But that's beside the point. For me, being agnostic, I wouldn't absolutely believe in God, right? I wouldn't absolutely believe in anything, even if I wanted to, even if I was able to, because I'm not able to, right? You're forever bound to that reasoning once you get to that reasoning, right? And because I don't want to believe in anything absolutely, because and it's for contradictory reasoning, right? Because my desire for meaning is just too great to accept any one meaning, right? Since I'm fully aware of the fact that I'm unable to verify the absolute truth of anything. That is, I'm agnostic precisely because of the absurd. I neither believe nor disbelieve in God, just as I neither believe nor disbelieve that I'm in the matrix, right? But I'll admit that I can lean towards pantheism at times, right? Which is the belief that everything is God. But even so, the absurd still sticks with me. I'm still fully aware that pantheism can't be verified. So I don't actually believe in it, right? I don't believe in it 100%. It's kind of just a thought, a nice thought for me. Now, for Kierkegaard, Camus writes, quote, he gives the irrational the appearance and God the attributes of the absurd, unjust, incoherent, and incomprehensible. Intelligence alone in him strives to stifle the underlying demands of the human heart. Since nothing is proved, everything can be proved. This is again the logic that since you can't prove God, and that's end quote after proved. Since you can't prove God exists or doesn't exist, why not just believe that he exists? But of course, this is a simplification of both Camus' critique on Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard himself. Kierkegaard is a very confusing philosopher with a lot of contradictions. But nonetheless, Kierkegaard proposes the leap of faith in face of the absurd, right? And we learn that from Fear and Trembling. If you haven't read Fear and Trembling or listened to my episode on that, I suggest reading it and listening to the episode coming back. But Camus takes this as, quote, an almost intentional mutilation of the soul to balance the mutilation accepted in regard to the absurd, end quote. That is, Camus is almost claiming that Kierkegaard is committing philosophical suicide with the same depression as a literal suicide. So Kierkegaard's almost believing in God reluctantly, in a sense there. Quote, I want to know whether I can live with what I know and with that alone, end quote. And following this quote, he questions whether this is a matter of pride. As in, does one deny merely out of pride? Does one deny God merely out of pride? Camus' response to this is, of course, more or less, if so, so be it, right? Now, as you may know, pride is one of the seven deadly sins, what they call as a cardinal sin, right? That is partially because pride is an emotion that relates to stubbornness. If one is too prideful, they lack the ability to change. But Camus' pride is something he's willing to live with, if it means he will be living within his bounds of intelligence. Now, this is where I kind of break off from Camus. This is where I critique his thought, right? For instance, the statement, quote, I want to know whether I can live with what I know and with that alone, end quote, implies that Camus knows what he does not know, that he knows what he does and does not know, right? And I think this is where pride gets the better of him. The prideful belief that one does not entertain false or unknowable ideas blinds them to the possibility that the things they think they know could likewise be false and unknowable, right? Now, I see many nihilists and atheists making this very same cognitive error. and I think it closes them off to a lot of different modes of thinking about reality, right? These they're very materialists. The materialists will often think that they know what they don't know, right? Nonetheless, the example of pride is important, specifically because it is one of the cardinal sins, right? The seven deadly sins. As what follows is, quote, Kierkegaard's view, according to which despair is not a fact, but a state, the very state of sin. For sin is what alienates from God. The absurd, which is the metaphysical state of the conscious man, does not lead to God. The absurd is sin without God, end quote. And this makes a lot of sense because Camus is essentially saying that by remaining enveloped in the absurd, Camus remains in sin, that is, alienated from God. But since the absurd implies the inexistence of God, or at least the impossibility of proving his existence, the absurd is sin without God, whereas sin here means the state of despair. Quote, Kierkegaard may shout in warning, if man had no eternal consciousness, if at the bottom of everything there were merely a wild, seething forth producing everything, both large and trifling, in the storm of dark passions, if the bottomless void that nothing can fill underlay all things, what would life be but despair? End quote. This cry is not likely to stop the absurd man. Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. If in order to elude the anxious question, what would life be, one must, like the donkey, feed on the roses of illusion, and the absurd mind, rather than resigning itself to falsehood, refers to adopt fearlessly Kierkegaard's reply, despair. Okay. So it is, as the old maxim goes, the truth hurts, right? But then again, I see another flaw in Camus' reasoning here, right? He claims that he seeks the truth, but he also claims that there is no such thing as truth, right? This is his biggest blunder, and I think it is again a matter of pride. Even so, I see a stark similarity between this and Emerson's quote from Self-Reliance, if you recall. On my saying, what have I to do with the sacredness of traditions, if I live wholly from within? My friend suggested, but these impulses may be from below, not from above. I replied, they do not seem to me to be such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil. End quote. That is, like Emerson, the absurdists, regardless of what anyone says, will not let go of their own inner reasoning, right? Quote, no law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Camus would rather have despair than a false truth, just as Emerson would rather have hell than compromise his self-reliance. Again, the absurd requires a total rejection of hope, just as self-reliance requires a total rejection of given ideals. So after this, Camus finally makes a statement, quote, I am taking the liberty at this point of calling the existential attitude philosophical suicide. So he's calling existentialism as a whole as philosophical suicide, right? And he follows this with, for the existentials, negation is their God. To be precise, the God is maintained only through the negation of human reason. But like suicides, gods change with men. There are many ways of leaping, the essential being to leap. They always lay claim to the eternal, and it is solely in this that they take the leap, end quote. So essentially, the suicide here doesn't come from the belief in God, but rather a leap towards the reasoning that there is a God. That is, Camus isn't concerned with the belief in God. He actually thinks this is perfectly reasonable, right? What he is concerned with is how a mind can go from believing that the world has no meaning, right? That nihilistic starting point, to finding an infinite meaning and depth in the universe. This leap is the suicide in which he is referring to. It is a lapse in reasoning, the expelling of any sort of philosophical reasoning in order to make a leap to a claim that entirely contradicts their previous claim. Right? The claim in which they began their philosophical reasoning with. Right? It's kind of like believing that you should litter and then following that reasoning to the logical conclusion that you shouldn't litter, right? It's starting from a point of it's basically like the point A and point B contradict each other. That's kind of what he's saying, and that's a philosophical suicide. So on the following page, Camus makes a few good points with consciousness. Firstly, that thinking is learning all over again how to see. That is, how to direct one's consciousness. This is a very Nietzschean concept, as Nietzsche has often written that sight is the most important quality of the student, what they focus on, or their ability to direct their focus upon certain things, right? Secondly, Camus says that consciousness is the act of attention. Quote, consciousness suspends and experiences the objects of its attention, end quote. So consciousness is what you focus on. Again, it is sight. It is the ability to see. Not only the ability to see, but the ability to see one thing and not all the others within your field of vision, right? Like when I'm looking at a field, I'm not really, it's not like I'm paying attention to one thing at a time. I'm not paying attention to all the individual blades of grass. I'm either paying attention to the big picture or like one blade of grass or like particular aspects of the thing that I'm looking at, right? And with Camus' phenomenological approach, he claims that the absurdist merely uses their sight to study the world. And I would even say that what one decides to see is the important part here, right? This determines whether or not the absurdist is rebelling or merely committing philosophical suicide, right? Now, another important thing to note is that Camus claims that everything the site captures is a, quote, privileged place. And if you recall from The Stranger, Rousseau says that everyone is privileged. Putting these two together, I think he is saying that everyone has their sight focused on themselves. Now, another important thing to note is that Camus claims that everything the site captures is a, quote, privileged place. And if you recall from The Stranger, Rousseau says that everyone is privileged. Putting these two together, I think he is saying that everyone has their sight focused on themselves. And so they're privileged, right? In so doing, they feel that they are somehow special, that the universe is not indifferent to them because of their specialness, right? This type of thinking can entirely cloud one's judgment and lead to not only philosophical suicide, but suicide itself, right? It's because when you're constantly have your attention on yourself and your own thoughts, you can only have so much attention, right? You can only focus on so many things. You only put your sight on so many different things in the world. And if you're constantly focused on yourself and your own thoughts, you kind of get entrenched in this whole different universe that's separate from everything else, right? It's kind of like what we said from the last episode, right? You're in this other world. A lot of people who are thinkers, who delve into things internally, they're very depressed. And it's a good sign. I think Jordan Peterson quoted this, and of course, I know Jordan Peterson overrated, but obviously he's a psychologist, right? And I've heard him say that people who think a lot, who kind of focus internally, look inwards a lot, they're more likely to be depressed or have anxiety or things like that. And a lot of that is because they feel isolated, right? When you're always thinking to yourself, always pay attention to your thoughts and not how everyone else feels, you start to feel isolated. You start to feel alone. And a lot of times you can kind of come into your own world, and that world isn't confronted with other people's ideas So you can kind of start thinking things that are so unlike what other people think that you become kind of disillusioned from reality, right? So again, everyone's privileged. And I will also say that Camus makes the point that saying everyone is privileged or everything is privileged amounts to saying that everything is equal. What he means here, I think, is that every life is equal in the sense that you could have been born into any of them, right? You could have been born into any life. It was chance you were born into this one. This is an important insight to make because of Camus' philosophy that the absurdists must, quote, live within their means, no matter who they are or what those means entail. So with this focus on sight, Camus then claims that the absurd, quote, aims to enumerate what it cannot transcend. It affirms solely that without any unifying principle, thought can still take delight in describing and understanding every aspect of experience. The truth involved then for each of those aspects is psychological in nature. It simply testifies to the interests that reality can offer. It is a way of awaking a sleeping world and of making it vivid to the mind. And on that note of awaking, I highly recommend John Vervaeke's podcast, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It's a 50-part series where he kind of just goes through uh, the West's philosophical history with meaning. And he also talks about Buddhism and Eastern religion as well. Um, if one attempts to extend and give a rational basis to the notion of truth, if one claims to discover in this way the essence of each object of knowledge, one restores its depth to experience. For an absurd mind, that is incomprehensible. End quote. So basically, Camus is trying to figure out if he can live with just the bare consciousness of reality. Can Camus live life purely for the experience of it? Can he live life for the experience of life? Can he live life for the sake of life itself, right? Can he fight that fight for the fight itself, right? Recall from The Stranger how Rousseau found his jail cell entertaining at one point simply because he started memorizing where every little crack, curve, and edge was within his cell, right? This is what Camus is talking about. With the knowledge that one will never find a universal principle of reality, can one live with just reality within their means? Quote, I'm not interested in philosophical suicide, but rather in plain suicide. Okay. I will leave us off there. The next section is titled Absurd Freedom, and it is here that Camus lays the framework for his argument as to why life is worth living when one lives within their means. I will say that there is still a ton of interesting content that I skipped in this section. So I encourage you to go through and read it yourself. I didn't want to kind of say things that weren't really for the purposes of understanding the absurd and understanding Camus' argument for the absurd, because that would kind of go beyond the point of this series. And I don't want to also read everything because then I could just title this an audiobook for the Myth of Sisyphus, right? I'm just reading parts of it and explaining my interpretation of it, and hopefully bringing in some other philosophical works into play here to kind of bounce off ideas from different philosophers such as Nietzsche and Zapf and Emerson. Right. So anyhow, I'll catch you next Monday for Absurd Freedom. Let's get it, everyone, and just remember uh that life is good and life is worth living. And please, if you are struggling with this concept, read The Myth of Sisyphus in total, and I promise you, you will feel better. I promise you, you will feel better. It has helped me so much, kind of finding meaning in life, or not finding meaning in life, but finding a purpose in life and finding why life is worth living, even if it feels like a losing battle sometimes, right? So And if you want to support this podcast, just go to into-the-despacer.com and scroll down to The Man Who Killed God. And actually, I'll post a link to my novel in the description and also a link to all the merch that is available. So thank you so much for listening and peace out, everyone. Take it easy and have a good week.